What if I told you that in a small hospital in northern Maine, patients began experiencing the exact same dream 72 hours before their death? A dream so vivid, so consistent, that even the most skeptical doctors couldn't explain it away. Today, we're diving into one of the most disturbing medical mysteries of the 21st century. The case of Nurse Margaret Thorne and her impossible gift that turned into everyone's worst nightmare. Before we begin, I need to warn you, this story contains elements that will challenge everything you think you know about death, dreams, and the thin line between the living and the dead. If you're easily disturbed, now would be a good time to click away. But if you're ready to descend into one of medicine's darkest rabbit holes, then buckle up. This all began in 2018 at St. Bartholomew's Regional Hospital, a modest medical facility serving the rural communities of Aroostook County, Maine. The hospital had been operating for nearly 80 years without incident, treating everything from farming accidents to seasonal flu outbreaks. Nothing particularly strange had ever happened there until Margaret Thorne arrived. Margaret was 43 years old when she transferred to St. Bartholomew's from Boston General. Her personnel file was impeccable: 15 years of nursing experience, stellar recommendations, and specialized training in palliative care. What the file didn't mention, and what Margaret herself didn't know at the time, was that she carried something with her that would turn this quiet hospital into a place of absolute terror. The first incident occurred on a Tuesday in early October. Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez, a 78-year-old woman recovering from a mild heart episode, approached the nurse's station in a state of complete panic. She grabbed Margaret's arm with trembling hands and whispered words that would haunt everyone who heard them. "The pale woman came to me again. She told me, I have 3 days." Margaret, trained to comfort distressed patients, assumed Mrs. Vasquez was experiencing anxiety-induced hallucinations. She gently guided the elderly woman back to her room, administered a mild sedative as prescribed by the attending physician, and documented the incident as a brief episode of post-surgical confusion. 3 days later, Eleanor Vasquez died in her sleep. The death itself wasn't suspicious. At 78, with a history of cardiovascular problems, her passing was medically explicable. The autopsy revealed nothing unusual, a simple cardiac arrest during sleep. But what happened next would begin a pattern so disturbing that it would eventually shut down an entire wing of the hospital. 2 weeks after Mrs. Vasquez's death, James Morrison, a 64-year-old construction worker, being treated for a broken leg, stumbled out of his room at 3 in the morning. The night shift found him in the hallway, weeping uncontrollably. When they asked what was wrong, James described a dream that was identical in every detail to what Eleanor Vasquez had reported. "There was this woman," he sobbed, "pale as milk, wearing old-fashioned clothes. She didn't speak, but somehow I knew what she was saying. 3 days. I have 3 days left." James Morrison died exactly 72 hours later from what the medical examiner ruled as a massive pulmonary embolism, a blood clot that had traveled to his lungs. By December of that same year, 17 patients had reported the identical dream. 17 patients had died exactly 3 days after their encounter with the pale woman, and every single one of these patients had been under the direct care of Nurse Margaret Thorne. The dreams were described with unsettling consistency. Patients would find themselves in what appeared to be their hospital room, but everything was wrong. The walls were a sickly yellow color instead of the standard hospital white. The medical equipment looked outdated, like something from the 1950s, and standing at the foot of their bed was a woman in her 30s, wearing a nurse's uniform from decades past. Her skin was translucent white, her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her eyes were the color of winter frost. The woman never spoke, but patients universally reported hearing her voice in their minds, always delivering the same message: "Your time here is ending. 3 days remain." Some patients described feeling an overwhelming sense of peace during the encounter. Others were filled with inexplicable dread. But all of them knew, with absolute certainty, that what they had experienced was not just a dream. Dr. Patricia Hawthorne, the hospital's chief of medicine, initially dismissed these reports as coincidental. Terminally ill patients often experience vivid dreams about death, she reasoned. The fact that they were dying wasn't supernatural, it was statistically predictable, given their medical conditions. But, as the reports continued to pour in, and as the 3-day pattern proved unnervingly accurate, Dr. Hawthorne began to suspect something far more disturbing was happening. The turning point came when Sarah Chen, a 28-year-old teacher, who had been admitted for routine appendix surgery, reported the dream. Sarah was young, healthy, and her surgery had gone perfectly. There was no medical reason for her to be in any danger. Yet she awoke from her post-surgical nap in tears. Describing the pale woman in exact detail, Dr. Hawthorne made the unprecedented decision to place Sarah under constant observation. For 72 hours, medical staff monitored every aspect of her condition. Her vital signs remained stable. Her surgical site was healing normally. By all medical standards, Sarah Chen should have been discharged the following day. On the third night, at exactly 11:47 p.m., Sarah Chen went into sudden cardiac arrest. Despite immediate intervention by the hospital's emergency response team, she could not be revived. The autopsy revealed an undiagnosed genetic heart condition that had never manifested symptoms until that fatal moment. The condition was so rare that most doctors never encounter it in their entire careers. This was when the hospital administration made a chilling discovery. They pulled Margaret Thorne's employment records and found something that should have been impossible. Every patient who had reported the pale woman dream had been admitted to the hospital on days when Margaret was working. More specifically, each patient had been under Margaret's direct care for exactly 24 hours before experiencing the dream. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. When hospital administrators confronted Margaret about these coincidences, they discovered something that sent ice through their veins. Margaret had been experiencing the dreams too. Not about her own death, but about the deaths of her patients. She would dream of the pale woman visiting specific patients, and she would wake up knowing, with horrible certainty, who would die. In 3 days, Margaret broke down during the meeting with hospital administrators. Through tears, she revealed that these dreams had been plaguing her for months. She had tried to convince herself they were just stress-induced nightmares, but their accuracy was undeniable. She knew which patients would die, when they would die, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The hospital immediately placed Margaret on administrative leave and launched a full investigation. What they discovered in the historical records of St. Bartholomew's would chill them to the bone. In 1953, a nurse named Catherine Morse had worked at the hospital. Catherine was known for her exceptional dedication to terminal patients. She would often stay late into the night, holding their hands as they passed away. Hospital records from that era described her as having an almost supernatural ability to know when a patient was about to die. She would appear at their bedside hours before their passing, providing comfort during their final moments. Catherine Morse had died in 1954 during a flu outbreak that claimed several hospital staff members. But here's the disturbing part. Every description patients gave of the pale woman in their dreams matched historical photographs of Catherine Morse exactly. The same severe hairstyle, the same vintage nursing uniform, the same translucent pale skin that Catherine had been known for during her lifetime. The investigation revealed something even more unsettling. Margaret Thorne had been born in 1975 in the same small Maine town where Catherine Morse had lived. Margaret's grandmother had been Catherine's roommate at the nursing school they both attended in the early 1950s. When investigators dug deeper, they found that Margaret's grandmother had been pregnant when Catherine died and had named her daughter Margaret's mother, Catherine, in honor of her deceased friend. The connections were too numerous and too specific to be coincidental. It appeared that somehow, Catherine Morse's spirit had attached itself to Margaret's family line, passing from generation to generation until it found someone who worked in the same profession, in the same hospital where Catherine had died. But the story doesn't end there. After Margaret was placed on leave, the dreams stopped. For 3 months, no patient at St. Bartholomew's reported any unusual experiences. The death rate returned to normal statistical averages. The hospital administration breathed a collective sigh of relief and prepared to quietly transfer Margaret to another facility. That's when Margaret Thorne disappeared. On March 15, 2019, Margaret failed to report for her scheduled meeting with hospital administration. When security checked her apartment, they found it completely empty. Not just packed up and moved out, completely empty, as if no one had ever lived there. Her landlord claimed to have no record of her ever being a tenant. Her bank accounts had been closed for months. Even more disturbing, when the hospital tried to contact her previous employer in Boston, they were told that no one named Margaret Thorne had ever worked there. It was as if Margaret Thorne had never existed. The final piece of this terrifying puzzle came to light 6 months later. Dr. Patricia Hawthorne received a phone call from a colleague at Sacred Heart Medical Center in Portland, Oregon. Patients there had begun reporting identical dreams about a pale woman who visited them exactly 3 days before their deaths. The dreams were identical in every detail to what had been reported at St. Bartholomew's. The nurse caring for these patients was a woman named Catherine Morse. When Dr. Hawthorne requested a photograph of this Catherine Morse, what she saw made her blood run cold. It was Margaret Thorne, or someone who looked exactly like her. But according to the hospital records in Portland, Catherine Morse had been working there for over a year, which would have been impossible if she was really Margaret Thorne. Since then, reports have surfaced from hospitals across the country. Denver, Colorado, Birmingham, Alabama, Syracuse, New York, always the same pattern. Patients experiencing identical dreams about a pale woman, followed by death exactly 72 hours later. And always, there's a nurse on staff whose background doesn't quite check out, whose past seems mysteriously blank. The most disturbing theory that has emerged from this case is that Catherine Morse never really died in 1954, that somehow her consciousness or spirit learned to transfer itself from person to person, taking over their identities and continuing her work as a herald of death. Each time her cover is blown, she simply moves on to a new host, a new identity, a new hospital full of unsuspecting patients. Others believe that Margaret Thorne was always Catherine Morse, that the original nurse from 1953 found a way to extend her existence across decades by inhabiting new bodies and identities. The dreams, they theorize, are not warnings of impending death, but actually Catherine's way of claiming souls, marking them for collection exactly 72 hours later. The most chilling aspect of this entire case is that it's still ongoing. As recently as last month, there have been reports from a hospital in Phoenix, Arizona. The dreams, the 3-day pattern, the mysterious nurse whose background doesn't add up. St. Bartholomew's Regional Hospital closed its terminal care wing permanently in late 2019. The official reason given was budget cuts. But staff members who worked there during the Margaret Thorne incidents tell a different story. They claim that even after Margaret disappeared, patients in that wing continued to report strange dreams. Not about the pale woman, but about Margaret herself. Patients would dream of a nurse with kind eyes who would appear in their rooms and whisper apologies over and over again, as if she was sorry for something terrible that was about to happen. The wing remains sealed to this day. Hospital maintenance. Staff refuse to enter it alone, claiming they can hear footsteps in the empty hallways and the sound of medical equipment that no longer exists. Security cameras in that section of the hospital routinely malfunction, showing static, or, in some cases, images of rooms filled with patients and staff from decades past. So the next time you're lying in a hospital bed and you find yourself having a vivid dream about a pale woman in an old-fashioned nurse's uniform, remember this story. Check the clock when you wake up. Count the hours carefully. And if it's been exactly 72 since that dream, well, perhaps it's time to call your loved ones. Because somewhere out there, Catherine Morse is still working her shifts, still caring for patients in her own twisted way. And she's very, very good at her job. The question that haunts everyone who has studied this case is not whether Catherine Morse exists. The evidence is too overwhelming to deny. The question is, Where will she appear next? And more importantly, are you prepared for what happens when she decides that your time here is ending? Sweet dreams. If this story kept you awake tonight, make sure to subscribe for more tales from the darkest corners of medical history. And remember, sometimes the most caring nurses are the ones you should fear the most. Until next time, stay safe, and try not to dream of pale women in hospital corridors.